Great light to you all, to all a great light. I'm going to be reading David, Man of Passion and Destiny, chapter 4. David and the Dwarf, or David and the Dwarf. The most famous battle described in the Old Testament was not fought between two armies, but between two people. It was the battle in the valley of Elah between David and Goliath. But before we look at that fearsome duel, I want to look again at something that occurred prior to the battle. When the Lord said to Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Literally, God said, for man looks at the face, but the Lord looks at the heart. We, being human, are subject to that very problem. We are impressed with, or not impressed with, individuals because we judge on the basis of surface appearance. We look at the externals and we form opinions that are usually erroneous. If Yahweh's statement ever applied in the story of this battle, Goliath had all the things that would normally impress and intimidate. In this instance, however, David had been given the ability to see as Yahweh always sees, and he was neither impressed nor intimidated, because no matter how big the giant might be, Yahweh is greater, and no matter how powerful he might be, Yahweh is all powerful. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at the battleground. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Sokoh, which belongs to Judah, and they camped between Sokoh and Azekah and Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah, and draw up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley between them. 1 Samuel chapter 17, 1 through 3. The valley of Elah was not a narrow ravine, but more like a vast canyon. The ancient site was probably about a mile wide, and toward the mouth of the canyon, it opened up even wider. At the bottom of the canyon or ravine, between the two slopes was strimmed was the stream bed, where David found the stones for his sling. To that there was a great slope, a half mile or more in size. Opposite was another vast slope of another half mile, stretching a full mile across. About it on one slope was the army of Israel, and on the other, the army of the Philistines. This was the setting. Now let's consider the major characters in our drama. First, there was Goliath, whose size and appearance was so impressive that the writer describes him in exacting detail. Goliath, front and center. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits in a span. We don't understand precisely what that description means at face value, because we don't measure things by cubit or a span. We measure them by feet and inches. So let's put it into our lingo. Goliath was somewhere near 9'9" tall, an erroneous man. The NBA would love him. And if he add to his height the length of his arms, when he would lift them up over his head, you can imagine what an imposing creature he must have been. But it wasn't just his size. 1 Samuel chapter 17, 5 through 7. And he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was clothed with scale armor. which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had bronze greaves on his legs, and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. He was wearing what we would call a coat of mail. The Philistines guard themselves for battle with a heavy canvas-like undergarment interlaced with overlapping ringlets of bronze. This coat of mail went from shoulder to knee, covering and protecting against the enemy's weapons. Body armor of such material and size weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. In our terms, it weighed between 175 and 200 pounds. That was the armor alone, just a coat of mail. But Goliath also wore a bronze helmet and bronze leggings to protect his shins, and he carried a bronze javelin or spear slung between his shoulders. The head of his spear alone weighed 600 shekels of iron, or about 20 to 25 pounds. The written account also says that he had a shield carrier who walked before him. The Hebrew word here is one that refers to the largest shield used in battle, the size of a full-grown man. It was obviously designed to protect his body from the arrows of the enemy. So in addition to his body armor, Goliath had this fellow running in front of him, carrying a man-sized shield as double protection. Pause a moment and allow your mind to picture such an imposing sight. Imagine how frightening it would be to take on a giant of this size, protected by this amount of armor. Clearly, the odds are stacked against anyone foolish enough to face him in battle. Notice what the gigantic warrior did. 1 Samuel 17, 8 through 9. He stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine, and you servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us." What Goliath did was suggest a tactic commonly used in the Eastern world, and that is representative battle. A one-on-one fight, it would represent the Philistine army, and whoever Israel chose would represent the Israelite army. Whoever won, his army won, and whoever lost, his whole army lost. There's no reason for your entire army to be involved in this. Just send a fighter, and I'll take him on. I am the champion. I am the greatest. Goliath didn't issue this challenge one time and then leave. No, his challenge went on for 40 days. Every morning and every evening for well over a month, he marched out there, flaunting his size and his strength, daring someone to take him on. How applicable to any giant we encounter. That's the way with the giants of fear and worry, for example. They don't come just once. They come morning and evening, day after day, relentlessly trying to intimidate. They come in the form of a person or a pressure or a worry. Some feel their hammers on your heart every morning and every night, day in and day out, yelling across the ravine in your own personal valley. Few things are more persistent and intimidating than our fathers or our fears and our worries, especially when we face them in our own strength. Enter David, the real giant. Meanwhile, about 10 or 15 miles away, up in the Judean mountains in the little hamlet of Bethlehem, a teenager named David was keeping his father's sheep. He was too young to be fighting in the army. In fact, at that point, David probably knew very little about what's happening between the Israelites and the Philistines. He may have never ever heard of Goliath. All he knew was that his three oldest brothers were fighting in Saul's army. David's father, however, was very concerned about this three eldest son. Jesse was getting old and probably unable to make the trip through the mountains himself. So he called his youngest son and said, "David, I want you to run an errand for me." 1 Samuel 17, 17 through 18. Take now for your brothers, your brothers an ephah of this roasted grain and these 10 loaves, and run to camp to your brothers. Bring also 10 cuts of cheese to the commander of their thousands, and look into the welfare of your brothers and bring back news of them. David wasn't going there to fight. He was just sent by his father to bring his brothers some refreshments. Make sure they were all right and let them know that dad was concerned about them. The sun rose that morning, just like any other morning for both David and Goliath. That's the way it often is in life. No warning. But the truth is, the 41st morning of Goliath's challenge will be the last day of his life and the first day of David's heroic life. Nobody announced it. No angel blasted a horn from heaven saying, Goliath, today your history, or David, this is your day. That morning, David arose early, and after leaving his flock of sheep with another shepherd, did exactly what his father had told him to do. And he came to the circle of the camp while the army was going out in battle array, shouting the war cry. Whoa. I'm trying to imagine what must have been, no coincidence. I'm trying to imagine what must have been going through David's mind as he came over the top of the last rise and saw that army spread out below him. I wonder if he stood and stared with his mouth open as he sized up the scene. I wonder what went through his mind. It must have been exciting and frightening all at the same time for this young man who had spent years out on the lonely hillside with only the sheep and the other shepherds for company. Then, as he gets to the edge of the Israelite camp, he sees the troops heading out for battle and hears the war cry. You can tell he's excited. He wants to watch to see what's going to happen. Any child would. 1 Samuel 17:22 through 23. Then David left his baggage in the care of the baggage keeper and ran to the battle line and entered in order to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, behold, a champion of the Philistines from Gath named Goliath was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words, the ones he's been yelling for the past 40 days, and David heard them. Picture the moment. David is standing there talking to his three brothers, when all of a sudden he hears this loud cry from across the ravine, and suddenly everyone around him is rushing to the rear and climbing in their tents. When all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and were greatly afraid. Remember, David has never seen this giant from Gath or heard his challenge. Suddenly he's standing there alone as everyone around him runs for cover. At least that's the way I read it. He looks across the battlefield and he sees this giant of a guy encased in armor, shouting out threats and defiance and cursing the God of Israel. And that made David livid. No one talks that way about the Yahweh of Israel, he thought. So why is everybody running away? Remember now, this is the 41st day the Israelites had encountered Goliath, but this is the first time it's happened to David. Isn't it interesting how hindsight gives a lot of insight? Have you ever faced a Goliath and then 3 days later you look back and say, man, I wish I'd done such and such? That's hindsight perspective, and it's usually infallible. When you look back, you always know a better way. But at the time it happens, you sort of shoot from the hip, unless you're a David. David had the character to see the present as though seen with hindsight, and he wasn't impressed, nor was he intimidated. What a wise young man. Look at what he does. 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 26 through 27. Then David spoke to the men who were standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Palestine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is the uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living Yahweh? And the people answered him in accord with this word, saying, thus it will be done for the man who kills him. Now, Saul had devised an incentive plan for the giant. The problem was he was actually the one man in the camp of Israel who was qualified to fight Goliath. Remember, he stood head and shoulders above everybody else, and he was the leader of the people. But Saul was a coward because he was not walking with Yahweh. So he had worked out a plan that hopefully would get somebody else out in the battle. He promised the man who killed Goliath a reward of great riches. He promised him his daughter's hand in marriage, and he promised to exempt his father's house from paying taxes. Well, I'm not sure the daughter was much of a reward. You'll see when when we meet her later. But a bride, great riches, and a perpetual tax exemption plan don't sound too bad, but not even that was enough to prompt a volunteer. The guy standing around, David told him about this incentive plan, all sorts of external motivations. By the way, I want you to notice something about Goliath's position on this particular day. When Goliath first issued his challenge, he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. But look at what it said the day David arrives. Have you seen this man who is coming up? That's right. Goliath has now crossed the ravine at the base of the valley and is coming up Israel's side. You see, if you tolerated Goliath, he'll take over your territory. He'll move into your camp. He'll take your thoughts that normally ought to be on Yahweh, and he'll put them on himself. That's why you can't afford to tolerate giants. The next thing that happens to David is what I call the older brother syndrome. It's what Christians often go through during a time of standing by faith. They get flack, and often it comes from members of their own family. 1 Samuel 17:28. Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger burned against David. And he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. Don't forget who Eliab really is. He's the son of Jesse, who first walked into the house. And Samuel thought, that's the king, remember? That was when God put his hand on Samuel's shoulder and said, no, no, that's not the one. And a little later, on Eliab's, was standing there where the horn of oil was emptied on the head of David. And the older brother saw the younger brother chosen to be king. The younger gets blessed above the older. Usually it's hard for the older brother to handle that. It certainly was in this instance. Eliab remembered that this little brother who had been anointed by the great priest and prophet Samuel, and now he got his strokes in. He said to David, why have you really come? In other words, he attacked David's motive. Look, David, why have you really showed up here? Then he asked the second question, which was designed to humiliate David. Hey, David, where did you leave that handful of sheep? Just sort of twisting the knife. And then he gets downright ugly. I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart. You just came here for the excitement. You just wanted to see the battle. Isn't it interesting how we could so easily and readily see our own guilt in somebody else's life, who really had the insolent, wicked heart, Eliab, the older brother? I know where you're coming from, he said. You've come down in order to see the battle. There's also a possibility that the Hebrew text implies you have come down to be seen in the battle. Now, at this point, the average person would have rolled up his sleeves and used all his energy to punch his brother's lights out rather than dealing with Goliath. Instead, David just ignores him as if to say, hey, all I did was ask a question. Now, let's go on to the important thing. That giant out there. And he just turns away. David knew who to fight and who to leave alone. We need to choose our battles wisely if you don't watch it. All of your battles will be fought among fellow members of the family of God. Meanwhile, the real enemy of our souls roams around our territory, winning victory after victory. The scene suddenly changes from Eliab and David to Saul and David. When Saul heard about the questions David was asking and the comments he was making, Saul sent for him. Now keep in mind that King Saul is the guy who doesn't want to fight, but he won't admit it. And David said to Saul, let no man heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. Then Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. 1 Samuel 17:32 through 33. Man is impressed with the externals. He doesn't see the heart. God is different. He doesn't judge by appearance or intelligence. King Saul hadn't learned that. However, so he looked at David and said, you don't have the size for it. You're just a kid. Look over there at that giant. As I picture it, David was blinking and thinking, what giant? The giant in my life is God. That's a dwarf over there, Saul. God is not impressed with the externals. He looks on the heart. God is omnipotent. And if he's on my side, omnipotence can't lose. David then describes to Saul how in the past God proved himself faithfully when David slew a bear and a lion. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. So often when facing our giants, we forget what we ought to remember and we remember what we ought to forget. We remember our defeats and we forget the victories. Most of us can recite the failures of our lives in vivid detail, but we're hard pressed to name the specific, remarkable victories God has pulled off in our past. Not so with David. He says, you know why I can fight Goliath, Saul? Because the same God who gave me power over a lion and a bear will give me power over Goliath. It is God who will empower me. So just let me at him. Well, that lets Saul off the hook. So he says, go and may the Lord be with you. Isn't it remarkable how people can use spiritual cliches to cover up their empty lives? They know all the right words to use, all the pious sounding sayings. Saul sure did. Then Saul said, now wait a minute, David. We have to fix you up for the battle. Imagine it. You can't tell me the Bible doesn't have humor because it says that Saul clothed David with his garments. Here's Saul at 52 long and David is a 36 regular. And so Saul drags in all this heavy armor and then says, put this on, David. He hands David his sword, but it's so big he can't even hold the thing. He drops his oversized helmet onto his head. Clunk. He wraps his coat of mail around the young man. And David says, Saul, I can't fight with this stuff. I can't even walk in it. And I sure haven't tested it myself in battle. So David dropped Saul's sword and slid out of the armor. Foolishness. What works for one person will not necessarily work for someone else. We're always trying to put our armor on someone else or put someone else's armor on ourselves. But that's not the way to do battle. It was a great breakthrough in my own life when I finally discovered that I could be me and God would use me. I couldn't operate well wearing another's armor. God provides unique techniques for unique people. So here's David stripped down to his own simple garments and armed with his own simple shepherd weapons, his sling and his staff, ready to do battle. Then comes that crucial moment, 1 Samuel 17:40. And he took his stick in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand. And he approached the Philistine. The beautiful thing about this story is that it's a perfect example of how Yahweh operates. He magnifies his name when we are weak. We don't have to be eloquent or strong or handsome. We don't have to be beautiful or brilliant or have all the answers to be blessed of Yahweh. He honors our faith. All he asks is that we trust him, that we stand before him in integrity and faith, and he'll win the battle. God is just waiting for his moment, waiting for us to trust him so he can empower us to battle our giants. Remember, Goliath is still a giant, still an imposing presence. David had all the odds against him. There wasn't a guy in the Philistine camp, or probably the Israelite camp either, who would have bet on David. But David didn't need their backing. He needed Yahweh, none other. After picking up the stones, he approached just a gigantic Philistine warrior. The shepherd boy made the giant smile. Wait, a joke? Oh, what a joke. 1 Samuel 17, 41 through 46. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord, host, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a Yahweh in Israel. Exit Goliath the dwarf. Just imagine it. David stood before this massive creature unintimidated. Intimidation. That's our major battle when we face giants. When they intimidate us, we get tongue-tied. Our thoughts get confused. We forget how to pray. We focus on the odds against us. We forget whom we represent, and we stand there with our knees knocking. I wonder what God must think when all the while he has promised us, my power is available. There's no one on this earth greater. You trust me. But David's eyes weren't on the giant. Intimidation played no part in his life. What a man. His eyes were fixed on Yah, with invincible confidence in his Yah. David responded, that all this assembly may know the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's. There it is. That's the secret of David's life. The battle is the Lord's. Are you trying to do your own battle? Trying to fight it your way? Trying to outsmart the enemy, outfox him? You can't, but God can. And he's saying to you, you do it my way and I'll honor you. You do it your way and you're doomed to fail. The battle is mine. David lived. David lived by a very simple principle. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose. He didn't try to impress anybody in the army of Israel. He didn't try to impress his brothers. He didn't even try to impress Yah. He just ran to meet Goliath. 1 Samuel 17, 49 through 50. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. All David had was a sling and a stone against a giant wearing 200 pounds of armor. It may seem silly, but that's the way Yahweh operates. In the final analysis, there was a whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. One stone flew through the air, and that's all there was to it. Goliath fell like a sack full of rocks. Got any more giants? The Philistine didn't wait around after that. When they saw that their champion was dead, they split the scene. Then David took the Philistine's head to Jerusalem. David had to use Goliath's own sword to cut off his head. But notice what he did with Goliath's weapons afterward. He put his weapons in his tent. He dragged that huge spear and that heavy sword into his own tent back on the Judean hillside as a reminder of what God has done. They stood there like silent trophies alongside the lion's skull and bear's paw. I wonder if perhaps David kept those trophies for the rest of his life. Who knows? Maybe after he became king, he had a weapon room with a trophy case where he kept the memories of God's past victories in his life. Out of this battle, the real truth emerged. Evidence to the truth on both sides of the valley of Elah. Goliath was the dwarf and David was the giant. Giants left lessons worth remembering. Winning victories is extremely significant. Remember them. Where do you keep your memories? Do you quickly pass over the victories? Break that habit. God doesn't waste victories. When he pulls something off that only he can do, he says to us, now don't you forget that. In the Old Testament times, Yahweh had his people pile up huge stacks of stones as reminders of his winning various victories on their behalf. Those stones of remembrance were to remain for all to see and remember. 4 lessons emerge from the significant battle between David and Goliath. Read them slowly, remember them well. Facing giants is an intimidating experience. We can look back at David's bravery and victory with the perfect hindsight and the safe distance of 2,000 years. But humanly speaking, imagine what it must have felt like to face the intimidating presence of that brute, even with the eyes of faith. Yet David said, my Yahweh is greater than he. Number 2, doing battle is a lonely experience. No one else can fight for you. Your Goliath is your Goliath. Someone else might say, don't worry about that. But to you, it's a Goliath, and nobody else can battle him for you. Not even a counselor or a pastor, not even a parent or a friend. It's lonely, but it enables you to grow up. It's on the lonely battlefield that you learn to trust Yahweh. Number 3, trusting Yahweh is a stabilizing experience. David brought down Goliath with the first stone. His aims was true and didn't miss the mark. We can't know for sure, but from every indication, he didn't have the jitters when he went into battle. He was stabilized by his trust in Yah. If you try to tackle the giant in the flesh, you cannot get it done. You'll lose. But when you have spent sufficient time on your knees, it's remarkable how stable you can be. Winning victories is a memorable experience. We're to remember the victories of our past. We're to pass on our lion in bear stories, our own Goliath victories. I don't know what your intimidating giant is today. It may relate to your job, your roommate, or your school. Maybe it is a person, a lawsuit, unemployment, a disaster, maybe even your own partner in life. Perhaps it is some fear that is lurking around the corner, sucking your energy and draining your faith. God is saying to you right now, all I ask of you is 5 smooth stones and a sling of faith. I'll take it from there. You don't have to wear somebody else's armor. You just trust me, and I'll strip you down to nothing but faith. And then I'll accomplish a victory where I'll get the glory. But as for you, you trust me. Perhaps you don't know what lies across the valley. Maybe you can't get a handle on what the giant is, but it's there, haunting you. That uncertainty alone is a giant. But look at the worry, or that worry, in comparison to the Lord Yahweh himself, and say by faith, the battle is yours, Lord. It is your battle. I lean on you. I give you all my weapons. all my skills, and I stand before you trusting you. It is Yahweh's love for us that caused him to bring us to an end of our own strength. He sees our need to trust him, and his love is so great that he would not let us live another day without turning over our arms to him. Our fears, our worries, even our confusion, so that nothing becomes more significant to us than our Father. Never ever forget it. The battle is the Lord's. Amen. Great light to y'all. Great light to you, mother. Great light to you, sister.